All right, so let's dive into something that you specifically requested, using logic and reasoning in everyday life. You're particularly interested in how to identify those sneaky assumptions, the assumptions that we all make, and then overcome them. And you sent over some excerpts from Balancing Love and Wisdom to guide us. Honestly, the title alone, it's got me intrigued.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read. Essentially, it's all about training your mind to see the world more clearly. And it does this by using logic and reasoning. But, and this is key, it's not about becoming some kind of cold, unfeeling robot. The source, it really emphasizes this, pairing logic with love and compassion.
That's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily put logic and love together. It almost sounds like a contradiction. How does that even work?
Right. We often kind of see them as opposites, but the source makes this really compelling case for their interconnectedness. And they use this really great analogy of a flashlight in a dark room. So imagine you're stumbling around, bumping into things because you can't see. Logic, the source argues, is like that flashlight. It illuminates what's actually there, not just the shadows that our minds might be creating.
Okay, so those shadows, those are our assumptions.
Yeah,
The things we just take for granted without really even thinking about them, examining them.
exactly. And the source actually describes assumptions as these invisible walls that limit our understanding. For example, imagine a detective that's trying to solve, like, a cookie theft. And it's really tempting to just immediately blame the usual suspect.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely. I can definitely relate to that. It's so easy to just go with your gut.
Right. Maybe a mischievous younger sibling.
Yeah, exactly.
But logic, the source would argue that logic dictates that you gather evidence first. Like, check for crumbs, ask who was in the kitchen. You follow the trail of evidence before you start pointing fingers.
So logic keeps us from jumping to conclusions and making potentially unfair accusations, at least when it comes to missing cookies. But how do we apply this to less delicious situations? Does the source give us any kind of guidance? Like how to actually use logic?
It does. It provides this, like, really practical framework. It kind of breaks it down to a series of steps. So you start by clearly defining the question you're trying to answer or the problem that you're trying to solve. Then you gather all the known facts and evidence related to the situation.
So no more relying on hunches or gut feelings.
Well, not entirely. I mean, those can be helpful starting points, but the source emphasizes, like, backing them up with solid evidence. And then the next step is to actually identify any assumptions that you might be making about the situation.
I have a feeling this is where it gets a little tricky. We all have our biases and preconceived notions. It can't be easy to spot them in ourselves.
You're absolutely right. It definitely takes practice and self-awareness, but the source argues that this is like a crucial step. It even dives into, like, some of the common logical fallacies that we often fall prey to, like the confirmation bias.
Oh, interesting. So the source isn't just about using logic. It's also about recognizing when our thinking might be illogical. Are there any other fallacies that it mentions?
There are quite a few, actually, but one that really stood out to me, and one that we probably encounter quite often, is the false dilemma fallacy.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. What is that?
It's when we present a situation as having only two options, when in reality there might be other possibilities.
Ah, okay, yeah. I can see how that could lead to some, faulty conclusions. So how does logic help us avoid this trap?
The source emphasizes the importance of considering different perspectives. So, looking at the situation from multiple angles. It encourages us to ask ourselves, are these really the only two options? Are there other factors at play that I haven't considered?
That makes sense. It's like expanding your field of vision so you see the bigger picture. So once we've identified and challenged our assumptions and considered all these different perspectives, what's next?
The next step is to apply consistent principles and rules to connect the evidence and perspectives that you've gathered. This might involve using, like, cause and effect reasoning, or looking for patterns, or applying, established theories or frameworks.
So it's about creating like a coherent narrative based on the evidence, not just some like random collection of facts.
Exactly. And then once you've done that, you can actually draw your conclusions. But the source really emphasizes that this isn't like a one and done process. The final step, and this is crucial, is to constantly test and revisit your reasoning as you go along. New information might come to light, or you might realize you missed something important.
It's like a constant cycle of learning and refining your understanding.
Precisely. The source, it really emphasizes that using logic is about embracing uncertainty and being open to revising your conclusions as you learn more.
Okay, so that's the framework. It sounds pretty comprehensive, but I have to admit it still feels a little theoretical to me. How does all this play out in real life?
Well, luckily, the source provides a really helpful example, figuring out why houseplants' leaves are turning yellow.
Okay, plant whisperers, let's hear it. This houseplant example, I feel like this is something we can all relate to.
Right. I mean, it's such a common problem, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the first step, if we're following the framework, is to define the question. So, why are my plant's leaves turning yellow? And then you gather the facts. What kind of plant is it? Where is it? How often are you watering it? What kind of soil is it in? All of that.
You're like a plant detective.
Exactly.
Instead of cookies, it's plants. I like it.
Exactly. And then you can start, challenging those assumptions. Maybe you just assume you're overwatering or that it's not getting enough nutrients. But the key here is to test those assumptions. Check that soil moisture. Look for signs of pests or diseases.
So it's about getting curious, gathering more information before you just jump to a conclusion, just like with our cookie thief.
Precisely. And you also want to consider different perspectives as well. Could it be, environmental factors like temperature or humidity? Could it be something about the pot or the drainage? The source reminds us that there are often multiple factors at play.
So many possibilities. So then how do we start piecing together all those clues?
That's where applying consistent principles comes in. So you might use cause and effect reasoning. For example, if the soil is really soggy, that's a good indication that you might be overwatering, which can lead to root rot and yellowing leaves. Or if it's not getting enough light, that could also impact its ability to produce chlorophyll, and that can result in pale or yellow leaves.
It's like you're building a case. You're gathering all the evidence, and then you use logic to connect the dots.
Exactly. So let's just say, in this case, you discover that the soil is bone dry. Even though you thought you were watering it regularly, maybe you realize that, the pot has a drainage issue, or that you've actually been underwatering.
Mystery solved. So you've identified the problem using logic and reasoning. What's that final step?
The testing and revisiting phase. So in this houseplant scenario, you might repot the plant. You adjust your watering schedule, or you make other changes based on your conclusions. And then you observe. Did the new leaves grow and healthy and green? If they did, you know your reasoning was sound. If not, it's back to the drawing board.
Like an experiment.
It is.
You have your hypothesis, you test it, and then you adjust as needed.
And that's what I love about this framework. The source really emphasizes that you can use this. You don't have to just use this for houseplants. You can apply it to all sorts of problems, all sorts of decisions that you make in your life.
Okay, so logic is starting to sound really useful here. But what about the love part? Where does that fit in?
That's a great question. The source really emphasizes that logic and reasoning are most powerful when they're balanced with love and compassion. It's not about just becoming some cold, calculating machine. It's about integrating logic with our hearts.
So it's not about replacing your emotions with logic. It's more like using logic to inform and guide your emotions.
Exactly. The source uses this beautiful analogy of logic and love being like two lenses in a pair of glasses. Alone, each lens gives you a blurry view, an incomplete view. But together, they bring the world into focus with clarity and depth.
I love that. It's like logic is giving us the focus, and then love is adding that warmth, that color. I'm starting to see how these two concepts can work together, but does the source give any concrete examples of what this looks like in real life?
Yeah, it does. It talks about how logic can help us make wiser decisions when it comes to relationships, for example. Let's say you're in a relationship that's causing you a lot of pain. Your heart might be telling you to stay, but logic might be kind of urging you to take a closer look, to examine the situation.
That's such a relatable dilemma. I think we've all been there. So how would using logic in a situation like that actually look?
Well, logic would encourage you to ask yourself some tough questions. Are my needs being met in this relationship? Is this person treating me with respect? Is this relationship contributing to my overall well-being?
Those are really important questions to ask, but those are hard questions to ask yourself.
Yeah.
Especially when you're caught up in all of the emotions.
Absolutely. And that's where that love and compassion come in. It's not about just coldly analyzing the situation, making a spreadsheet of pros and cons. It's about approaching those questions with self-compassion, with the understanding that even if the answers are difficult, you deserve to be in a relationship that's healthy and fulfilling.
Being honest with yourself even when it's painful.
Yes.
But also being kind to yourself.
Exactly. The source talks about how wisdom actually cherishes love. It understands that love is precious and that it needs to be nurtured and guided. And it recognizes that love can sometimes get lost in all the confusion or the chaos, and that logic can kind of help us find our way back to clarity.
I'm really liking this whole idea of logic being like a guide for love.
Mm.
It's like having a wise friend who helps you to see your relationships more clearly and make choices that align with your values.
I love that analogy. And you know what else the source does? It provides a set of reflective questions to help us integrate these ideas into our lives. It's like a toolkit for using logic and love in everyday situations.
Ooh, reflective questions. I love reflective questions. Give me an example.
Okay, here's one that really stood out to me. Before acting or speaking, have I carefully considered the facts and the evidence? Have I made an effort to understand all sides so my care is truly informed?
Wow, that's a powerful one. Reminds me of the cookie thief scenario. It's so easy to react, just impulsively, based on those assumptions. But if you take the time to gather the information, consider different perspectives, you can be led to much wiser actions, more compassionate actions.
Exactly. And that's just one example. The source actually has a whole series of questions that cover everything from perspective taking to self-awareness to long-term impact.
Okay, I am definitely going to have to check those out. This is starting to feel less like a cold, hard process and more like a pathway to self-discovery and deeper, more meaningful connections with others.
And I think that's a really great way to put it. That's ultimately what the source is all about. It's not about turning us into emotionless robots. It's about using logic and reasoning to help us,
Yeah.
empower us to live more fulfilling and compassionate lives.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way. Logic 80 love, who knew?
It is a powerful combination. And, as we were talking, something occurred to me. And it's not something that the source explicitly talks about. I think it's incredibly relevant.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so it's this idea of logic and love, particularly this balanced reasoning when we're dealing with a lot of information, when we're bombarded with conflicting information,
Yeah.
especially these days, you're constantly being pulled in all these different directions by narratives and facts. It can be so overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. It can be really disorienting at times. I think
Yeah.
we can all relate to that. It's like everyone has their own version of the truth,
Yeah.
And how do you know what to believe?
Exactly. And I think that this is where the tools that we've been talking about become even more crucial, Logic helps us to slow down and take a step back and evaluate the information critically.
So put on your detective hat again.
Right.
But this time, we're investigating the information itself, not just the situation.
Exactly. And so we ask ourselves, what are the sources of this information? Are they credible? Are there any obvious biases? What are the assumptions? And is there actually evidence to support these claims?
So logic is helping us filter out all of the noise and get down to what's really at the heart of the matter. But where does love fit into this?
Right.
Doesn't that just cloud our judgment?
I think that's a common misconception. But remember, we're not talking about blind, sentimental love here. We're talking about love as compassion, as understanding, empathy. And I think those qualities are essential when we're dealing with viewpoints that are conflicting.
So instead of just dismissing someone outright because we disagree with them, we try to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly.
And we can, even if we don't ultimately agree with their conclusion, we can at least try to understand where they're coming from.
And I think that's something that we just need more of these days, right? That ability to just have civil discourse, even when we disagree. To recognize that people can have differing opinions without being bad or wrong.
It's about having the humility to acknowledge that you might not have all the answers, that other perspectives are valuable, even if they're different from your own.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do, especially when we're emotionally invested in a particular issue. But I think that's where this discipline of logic paired with that open-heartedness of love can really make a difference.
It's like we're creating space for understanding, even in the midst of disagreement. We're not letting our emotions just run wild, but we're also not shutting down other viewpoints because they're different from our own.
I love that. It's like this beautiful dance between the head and the heart, using both to navigate the complexities of life.
To wrap up this amazing deep dive, it seems like the main takeaway here is that logic and love, they're not enemies. They're actually more like teammates. And when we use them together, it can help us to navigate all of life's messiness, with more clarity and wisdom and compassion.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's like this dynamic duo, helping us to see the world more clearly, to make wiser decisions, and connect with each other on a much deeper level.
And remember, everyone, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep using these tools to cultivate your own wisdom. And most importantly, keep letting your love light the way.
Beautifully said. Until next time, may your gardens flourish, and may your melodies resonate with truth and beauty.
That's a wrap. Happy weeding, everyone.